think this book will survive us all. My name is Jan Geurt Gaarlandt.
So, Jan, we're extremely pleased you could join us today, and extremely delighted you've put your time aside to talk about this remarkable woman, Etty Hillesum.
Yes.
And tell me more, first of all, how did you come across the published diary in its original form, and how much compilation work was there involved in
quite a lot, in fact. I came across the diaries because a man who had interviewed me about my work, I was a publisher at the moment, he knew that I was interested in Jewry and war. And then he said suddenly, well, I have a few diaries of a Jewish woman in my house, and I would like you to see them, and maybe you like them, and maybe there's a possibility you could publish them. Well, I got them, and I got one pile of very difficult to read yellow papers with a pin around it, and it was hardly possible to read it. But I was intrigued by it, and at a certain moment I picked it up and I read one page of it, and I suddenly realized this is very remarkable, what I see, what I read. And then I thought, well, okay, let's see. I was very busy at the moment, and I put it away again. But after a few weeks, I returned to that manuscript, and I sat down and read more and more, and I was fascinated by it and couldn't put it down, in fact. And then it all started. I asked the man who gave me a few of the diaries. There were more. So then he gave me one by one the whole package of diaries, and I said to him, it's fantastic, it's wonderful, it's impressive. I would like to make a book out of it, because it's way too long to publish the whole manuscript in one volume, because it's an unknown woman of a certain time, well, a very specific time in our history, of course, but it's very personal, very very spiritual, very much away from what we learn about the war, the daily war. So I have to think about it, how to bring this book to the public. And finally I started picking pieces together, trying to make her life visible through her diary, but in a way that a wider audience could grip it immediately.
Yes, and it strikes me that's interesting, because it's still, in my view, probably relatively speaking, considered an esoteric text, in the sense that, in fact, many Jews would know who Etty Hillesum is. Some of the rabbis I know have read the text, some haven't. But, non-Jewish people, she isn't necessarily a household name as Anne Frank is. And I don't know if that's, a bad thing. But the thing is, she's been... How many languages have you translated?
Well, there are maybe 18 languages really? So far.
Gosh.
And so it's... I just sold the Chinese rights, and I'm trying desperately to get the Russians to have this book, because Etty Hillesum, her mother was a Russian woman. She was half Russian, so to say, and she wanted to be a bridge between Russia and Europe.
Yes.
She says somewhere.
She makes references to
She
travelling
makes
through Russia into
references.
Siberia, I remember.
She
Yes,
studied
yeah.
Russian. She could read it. She reads Dostoevsky all the time and so on. So she knew her classics. Um, yes.
But I think that's wonderful, the fact you found these scribbles on paper, which were, they're so, you know, her language is so beautiful, and
Yes.
you translated really at least a couple of times in order to interpret her handwriting first of all.
Right, because before you
otherwise
can read her handwriting, that was quite a task. But
yes. And you did that bit all yourself.
yes, I did that
Fantastic.
myself. But I had a small team of people who worked it out at the end, because I couldn't do it all alone.
And have you been allowed to keep those original copies yourself? Or
No. I had them for years. Well, about 3 years I had them in my desk, lying around, and because I was working with them. Now they are at the Jewish Historical Museum, the originals, and they are heavily guarded, protected. And but I used to go around with them, and I was very familiar with them. It was part of my life, so to say.
We'll move on to slightly, perhaps more the spiritual aspects of the writings, because as I say, when I first came across the diary, it did transform my life completely, both on personal levels and spiritual levels. As I say, I read Anne Frank's diary at the same time, and although both were incredibly sophisticated women, Etty Hillesum being slightly older, she has other matters of romance and hormones to write about and to have
twice
within
as
her
old
life.
as
Absolutely.
Anne Frank.
And her spirituality, her spiritual qualities,
Yes.
I'm sure you've already said, in fact, would have come across to you straight away through her writing.
Yes, and that was where at first I was afraid of, that the people would be a bit anxious or a bit afraid of that kind of writing. But it turned out that that a lot of people, Jewish and non-Jewish, Christian and not Christian, all sort of people could recognize her writing. And that is a sort of miracle. First of all, she is writing as an artist, almost. You could say she's a writer, and that is what she wanted to be in the first place, which is very important to make it readable, to make it so that the people can take it in. The way she writes is so beautiful, but then the content as well is beautiful. But her voice is universal, so to say. That's what I mean when I say Jews and non-Jews can read it. There's not a particular orthodoxy or whatever. She has a belief in a God within her. She finds the words for her belief and her faith, and she does that in such a sincere way that everybody can understand what she means, and specifically in a time, in the hard times where she was living in. It makes it all the more strong what she did. And well, writing diaries is one thing, but being in a camp like she was in Westerbork later on, when she was there, she wrote letters, and she wrote also in her diary, but she wrote letters with a quality you can't imagine. She wrote about the way people were taken into the trains to Auschwitz. They didn't know it. They went to Auschwitz, but in fact that was the case. But she writes like someone who is so involved and at the same moment so detached and with an incredible strength and lovely way of finding words for the most difficult things there were.
And I absolutely, and in fact I'm sure that detachment you speak of, it can be a sign of a true intellectual, which she certainly was. But to be a true intellectual and yet to have such compassion, such givingness in her personality, I'm sure she wouldn't necessarily know. We were speaking of her altruistic qualities, 70 years on.
No.
We could speak more about that, or I could ask also a question, the spiritual transformation, the spiritual transition she makes throughout those years. She writes the diary. Would you say she realised what her fate would be, even on a subconscious level, and to still accept what was to happen and to still make that spiritual transition?
I'm sure she was aware of the fact that the Germans and the Nazis were determined to how do you say that, exterminate the people, the Jewish people. She knew that working in the East meant probably devastation and death. There were, at the same time she was writing her diaries, there were already warnings through the BBC and that the Jews going to the East would die there. How precisely was not known.
She mentions one figure, doesn't she? I think
yes.
It's ironically enough, a BBC World Service broadcast, 1942.
That's true.
Springtime,
you're
April-ish,
right.
And she mentions, I think it was 70,000 or 700,000, one of the two, were perishing in these death camps. But no one had any idea in what ways and what torture was involved.
You're right. The how the machinery was working was not known, of course, but there were quite a lot of rumors that the Jews would be perished there, and but nevertheless, she was she was aware of the fact that she wouldn't survive going to the East. I'm sure there are several places in her diary that she talks about it. At the other hand, there was that belief that there was a good side in humanity. There were still humane, there were still people who are good. Yes, and she was searching where the goodness of the people was, and she kept doing that, even in the darkest moments.
Up until the very end, she writes, doesn't she? I still believe in God, and I'm not embarrassed to say so. And
you're right.
And absolutely, she also believed in a higher psychological self. To make that spiritual transition was only possible to think in these means. I wonder though, because of course, not that I know very much about the exact history, but Amsterdam was one of the last countries to be affected by the war. It spread right through Poland, and then really, so in many ways, people felt relatively safe, even the Jewish community.
Yes, up till a certain moment.
But by then it was too late. They wouldn't have been able to leave the country.
It was too late.
Yes,
and more devastating for the Dutch people is that more than 100,000 Jews were sent away to the East, which is far more than percentage-wise than in other countries. So that is a black page in our history. The letting the well, the Germans were very clever in doing it, and there were so many people who were not aware of the danger, and they stayed and thought maybe the war will end soon. That hope, always that hope that the war would end soon, is also you can read that.
And I'm sure it would have made so little sense to someone like Etty or many of the Jewish people, the fact that the Jews were a contribution to society overall. Many were doctors or accountants and what have you. So why on earth would there be this ethnic cleansing against this community? You know, it would have, nothing really still makes very much sense, to be honest. You can study the history and still, you can't understand
you don't understand
the Nazis' minds and the Hitler's mindset. But
absolutely not. Yes.
Yes. And had she had a few opportunities to have left Amsterdam, I know Sher and a few of her friends did leave the country and then come back again. So she did have the opportunity. In fact, I think she makes a journey to Switzerland or one of the...
No, she didn't. No, not during the war. She was all the time there.
Was she?
But she was in the camp in Westerbork, which was a concentration camp. And she went in and out that camp because she had a sort of passepartout.
Yes.
But she could have run and she could have hid if she wanted. There were friends who wanted to do that, to help her. There were places she could go to.
One of the
but she didn't do it. She said, I want to be there, I belong there, I don't want to leave my family.
Yes, and do you believe it was also that altruistic sense that she felt she wanted to help her family and friends and stay with them, support them, keep them...
that was deeply her sense of, that was, in fact, her solidarity was, I think, one of the main points in her life.
She chooses, I think, even to go to the holding camps to Westerbork at times she needn't in order to help her friends.
She has chosen to do it,
which is unusual.
Yeah, that's very rare. I don't think there are. No,
I agree.
Absolutely.
It's also wonderful and interesting to note that at least two of the major religions, being Judaism and the Catholic Church, have wanted to claim Etty Hillesum for themselves, as it were.
Yes.
What do you say to that?
Well, I say that claiming is not a good thing to do. She is, and she would have say no to those claims, I think. She didn't feel specifically... She didn't have a Jewish faith or a Christian faith, although there are, from both religions, you can find, you can find...
many references.
Yes, references, of course.
And she studied the New Testament as
yes,
well and understood it, and it was very meaningful to her.
But you could say she was... even more into Rilke, the German
the romantic
poet,
absolutely.
And who was not Christian or Jewish at all.
No.
So she had many sides, but claiming is not a good thing.
And she had her own philosophy.
Her own philosophy, and there are certain Jewish communities who don't want to deal with her at all.
That's very interesting.
Yeah. Also here in Holland, they are not interested in her.
I suppose if she wasn't necessarily practicing Jew, the Orthodox Church probably wouldn't necessarily know.
Yeah.
How interesting.
There was even a letter of a known Jewish woman writer here in Holland who wrote a letter to the New York Times when the book was out in America, saying, well, this is not an interesting Jewish personality. Don't be so heroic about her. So that's that kind
How
of
fast you
things.
can
We
get.
have, yeah,
Oh dear.
yeah.
But she also lived in the time, around the same time, just after, and I think she, many see her as a mystic, and she has this excerpt in her diary
Yes.
near the end, 1943, and she says, some people are born into this world with a soul, some 15 years old, others, 1,000 years old. I feel like I've been here 1,000 times before, and mine feels 1,000 years old.
Yes.
I found this just so profound and wonderful, because depends how you interpret this, but there are schools of thought in the mystical Christian schools. For instance, I don't know if you know much of the work of the Russian philosophers Ouspensky.
Mm-hmm.
And,
I don't know much about it,
but this is very much along his lines of thought. And in fact, we actually belong to we belong to a philosophical school in Ouspensky's, where Ouspensky used to live in London. So this diary was actually given to me there.
Ah, okay, interesting.
So,
Interesting.
in fact, I spoke to the same paragraph with Rabbi Neuberger, Julia Neuberger in London, and she said, "Oh, I don't believe in any of that." She says, "I don't believe in the idea of eternal recurrence. Not reincarnation. It's very different. It's really a sense of really a soul that's allowed to develop. Really, is what I think I believe Etty was trying to say.
Yes.
And whereas Julia Neuberger thought, no, she thinks that she's living the lives of the thousands of Jews who have had to go through diaspora and perish throughout the ages. I don't know.
I think that her sense of solidarity, that's the expression for it. To live 1,000 lives, or that your soul is 1,000 years old, it means, I think, that she felt so deeply with all the people around her. And she had a very profound way of looking at people and at herself, mainly at herself, of course, because by discovering what was inside her, she discovered it for us, so to say. You could say that. For the reader. The reader goes with her inside her mind and soul. Yeah.
And I don't know where the paragraph is. I couldn't carry it. It's
No.
too heavy. But there she does say, it's such a Russian way of speaking. In fact, that some people have spirit, but it's not the same as a soul, and that's such a Russian way of thinking of speaking, isn't it? She refers to that a number of times. But and also she has this link, I know, to not necessarily if she'd come across Ouspensky's work, although I'm sure she would have loved it if she loves Dostoevsky and such forth. But she is there links, I know, to other mystics such as Madame Blavatsky, for instance, and that
I haven't heard about that. No. When she was more the old Christian mystics, that was more she got all the books from Sher, her lover, and in that book, the bibliotheek, how do you the library? The library.
Yes.
It was the library of Sher that she...
Absolutely, she nicked his whole library. Yes. she stole his...
Yeah. So I don't think Sher was into that Russian philosophy.
No, and we don't learn much about him. We only understand he's obviously an intellectual to a certain point, because he has certain authors on his bookshelf. But we learn little more than... some of the writers and composers he enjoys, and that he reads palms. Yes. Could you tell me more? Because I didn't really understand what this reading palms... No, it wasn't not reading palms as such, it was reading the hands.
He was reading hands, meaning the lines of the hands.
So he actually read the lines rather than the shape of the hands. Oh, so it's just palm reading.
Yes, it is palm reading, in fact. But he was not like the gypsies are doing it, but he tried to sort of putting what he saw, putting into a psychological, logical testament or whatever.
Profile.
Yes.
in my mind, Etty, such a strong character. At least you can. She describes herself so well. You can really get a true insight into her character. Whereas with Spear, I could not, understand
you could not
him very
grasp.
well. Not really.
No.
I couldn't understand whether he was slightly pseudo in the sense of he was more, not necessarily as I don't know, perhaps as spiritual as she was, but perhaps.
He was a strange figure.
Yes.
I know.
Very charismatic.
Charismatic. I know people who knew him
really?
eye to eye.
How interesting.
Yes, and they all said it was a very special man, and very clever and very direct and not out of the ordinary, so to say. But at the other hand, there's suspicion about him too. There are a lot of readers.
Well, he had a girlfriend, I know, in Paris or something.
Yes, and there was messing around with girls and women in a way, well, some readers are not fond of.
But yes, and I know that Etty is absolutely devastated, I know, at some point because of this, but she also has a few flings, you can say.
Absolutely.
That's part of her character, I think.
She's very modern the way
absolutely, and
she's
postmodern
thinking about sexuality and love and man, yes, and women.
Yeah, which is also very modern, postmodern.
Yes.
So that's very interesting. What else shall I ask? There's so many more questions. I just know I would. How long have we got? How long have you got, really?
No,
are you in a rush?
well, I'm not in a rush, but
just while you're thinking, I've got a couple of very basic ones, if you forgive me, which might help to tie it all together and so on. Can I just ask you, first of all, with those, who was Etty Hillesum? How old was she when she wrote her diaries, and under what circumstances?
Yes, Etty was 27 years old, I think, when she first met Julius Speer. And Julius Speer was, in fact, the one who brought her to pick up a diary and write her life down. She was in a bad mood when, or even feeling quite sick and not very happy she was when she first met him, and through him she got a sort of grip on her life. But she started one day in March 1941 writing down something about herself, saying, "Wow, this is not normal to write so openly about yourself, and I don't know what will come out of this exercise." But it turned out that she wrote the rest of her life in her diary, with an intense manner, and she was a real diary writer. I think that was her art, and her the best expression she could give. But Etty was living in a house together with 5 other people at the Museumplein here in Amsterdam, in the center of Amsterdam, looking out of when she looked out, she saw the Rijksmuseum, or she saw the IJsclub, the ice skate club in the winter, and she was a very, very clever student. She had studied law and was studying Russian and psychology at that very moment when she met Speer at a musician meeting with friends. Her brother was a brilliant pianist.
I was going to ask you more about him.
Yes.
He's a very interesting character as well, and went through as much tragedy as she did, really, in many ways, perhaps more so because he had a nervous breakdown, I think, near the end.
Yes.
And,
Yes.
ended up in an institution, as far as that's...
The whole family was, of course, very at a point of breaking down several times and breaking up several times. It was not a happy marriage her parents had. But Misha, we are talking about the brilliant pianist Misha, her younger brother, who was, by the way, there's just a book out about Misha Hillesum. His a composition of piano etude are just discovered, and there's a CD of his music. So he was not only a pianist but also a composer. Misha and the other brother was Jaap, also a very brilliant student, and he discovered certain medicines, so all these children of these two Hillesums were brilliant, in fact, but also at the edge of very, on the edge of, how do you say that? On the edge of panic, maybe. Yes. Even.
I'm sure they weren't alone, but she writes so clearly about this side of things. Yeah. And Misha Hillesum, there are many references to him playing. He particularly adored Schubert.
Yes.
Beethoven, I think you refer, yes. But he was a very good pianist, and also the fashionable composer of the time. For the ones who understood music, Hugo Wolf.
Yeah.
So these are the three composers I remember reading.
Yes, and there is some Chopin he played, Chopin, and that is also still on a CD.
Out of interest, the one thing I couldn't work out, Speer was an academic himself. What was his subject or topic? Because I know he lectures, but I could not figure out what.
No, Speer didn't lecture.
Oh, he didn't?
No, he didn't. He studied with Jung, the psychiatrist in Switzerland.
That's right.
He was a Jungian.
Yes. I imagined he had an academic life too.
Yes, he had. And later on, he was a publisher in Germany.
I see. Yeah, that's right.
And so he didn't lecture, but he was a charismatic man, as we said, and so he attracted all kinds of patients and women who were in difficulties, and he tried to heal them with a very special way of healing, so to say.
That's right. Because
wrestling, that is what he did with them, and not only wrestling, but also he talked with them and reading palms, so to say.
No, he was her main companion, you could say. At the start, it mentions Etty first saw him at a lecture or gets to know him because she's attended, but of course lecture probably meant a meeting. Or
a meeting, right.
So I imagine there were students sitting in a hall with him on stage.
No, that was not the case. No, that was somewhere in a home.
So it's good to know.
Yeah.
And of course, I don't really understand much about her personal life when it comes to her sexuality. She makes a few references, but we do get the inclination that she had quite a few lovers all at one go, simultaneously. And in fact, interestingly enough, am I right in understanding when I read she kept referring to Papa Han and Junior, his son? Was she also having...
No, she hadn't an affair with the son.
I see.
That was Hans.
Hans. Because she's very close to him physically, though.
Papa Han, that is her other lover.
Yes. I got the sense she was equally close to the son physically, but maybe I'm wrong.
I don't think so.
The way maybe I should read it again.
Yeah, well,
the way she talks about him being...
I talked to Hans in 1981.
Oh, you did?
Because I tried to find out if
survived.
the people... He survived.
Amazing.
Yes. And Han Wegerer, the man we
Yes.
are talking about, where she used to live in his house. He survived the war as well.
Of course, they weren't strictly speaking Jewish.
No, they weren't.
That's why, yeah.
They weren't.
No.
And it happened to be that there were so many people alive who are in this diary. I thought when I published the book, well, probably all these people where she's talking about are dead. They were not. Because
makes sense. Or she mixed as much with Catholics and Christians
yes,
as well
because
as
she was not in a specific Jewish circle.
Quarter, no.
Also, she had the most friends in Jewish circles because the family Levi, her very good friend, they went to Palestine later on after the war. So
makes it even more poignant and tragic, the fact she's lost to us
yes
now, and all of her close to her friends and
yes her close friends survived.
That's very sad.
In fact, but in Westerbork she made new friends, and for half a year maybe,
I don't know, the language itself on a more analytical level, reading the actual language, the style of the language, she's so poetic and
yes.
Philosophical the way she writes throughout the whole diary, but near the end I do get the sense that her language becomes that much more fragmented and less coherent in a way for me. I read it and I was trying to, at first you could read the first half of the diary and really understand it with just read it straight off, and when you later in the diary you're having to reread the sentences a few times because really the language is not, you can sense a real fear and anxiety, and she must be exhausted.
Yes, but at the other hand I think the best thing she wrote were the 2 long letters in Westerbork about the concentration camp, and she was writing that sitting in the middle of a total chaos.
Yes.
She was sitting on a bench somewhere, scribbling on a small paper the most beautiful letter about a concentration camp, I think, which is ever published. And everybody recognized that is so important, what she did there. So it was a sort of culmination, I would say. Her diary is a sort of bringing herself to a certain point that she could... Sorry about that. It's
a bit more editing for you, Martin. Sorry.
Yeah. That's an important bit, so I think if we can recap...
Well, it would be like your timer, you'll say, we've reached that point in the interview, so an hour later. So.
Perhaps you can just go...
Yeah, well, what I think as a reader, not as the editor, the diary, she is writing for maybe 2 years, and she discovers herself and the world, and after that she is able to step into a certain higher level of communication almost, and a higher level of seeing what is going on, and then in the middle of the total chaos she sits down and writes a letter about what is going on in the concentration camp where she is at that same moment, and she is able to write it down in a way no one ever forgets it. When you read those 2 long letters about Westerbork, it's a monument for these kinds of camps. I think in the world literature it is recognized also that these letters are among the best that is written about these camps.
That's and that the spiritual elevation she makes of actually still, even at that point, on some level, being able to accept her fate and not lose faith in humanity. And
Yes.
but it's. I've read it 3 or 4 times now,
Yeah,
and fallen. It's
yeah,
still every time I'm weeping. And
Yeah.
it has to. But may I ask one last question,
Yeah.
if we have time? Is that the other thing she does so beautifully is, as you mentioned, the psychological internalizing of her external life, and then being able to externalize her thoughts on paper and
Yes.
through her words. In her situation, where her physical world became smaller and smaller and more closed in, and more limited, she makes so many beautifully written references to objects that mean much to her, many of which I found so symbolic. For instance,
Yes.
she mentions a globe,
Yes.
which is so symbolic, because of course
Yes.
at this point she can't really travel as she would wish, and yet the globe's sitting there, and she's thinking, oh, one day I'll
Yes.
travel this globe.
And the flowers.
And the flowers.
And the trees.
Yes.
Before-
Really very young, very
Yes.
of that.
And so very simple things.
Yeah.
And she makes out of it pure poetry,
Absolutely.
I think.
I absolutely agree. And hopefully, is it tonight or tomorrow? I suppose it doesn't matter if you would be lovely if you could have, but I don't know if I have the energy to visit her apartment, which I feel I have a duty to do, really. And I may.
How far away is it?
It's a few blocks, isn't it, down towards the Rijksmuseum?
It's the Museumplein. It's not far from here. We could go there now, if you want.
Would you prefer? I'll have to take a few glucose tablets and see how I do.
I mean, if necessary, if you're not up to it, I could go with...
I know it's important for me to I should definitely be there. No.
Because I don't have too much time.
No, and I guess it's a commercial property now that people who live
Yes,
there,
we
it's
can't
a shame.
go in.
No, I think
it's
I would have
impossible.
broken down into tears if I had gone inside and
Yeah.
seen the view where she was, and so
Yeah.
it's probably best that we stay on the outside anyway. But
it's an important
that sounds nice, and we
place.
can have a coffee perhaps thereafter if you'd like.
Can I get in one more question while we're in here and a quiet thing?
Yeah.
We all know the events of the stories. A lot of our listeners won't have heard of her and won't realise the main sort of stages. So could you just very briefly, and it might help to link some of the clips that we'll use together, just tell us the story of the events of those last couple of years of her life when she was writing the diary?
Well, I make that very brief because you could say that what she went through was the from 1941 on to 1943, she was living her own life with friends and going to restaurants, going to concerts, going to lectures. It looks like a quite normal life, but all the time the situation is becoming more and more dangerous. The Nazis are closing in the Jewish people. She doesn't want to write much about that. She writes about her life, what she feels inside, how she writes about her love, about God, about all the things you don't imagine that was important for her. She led a life that was so intense in a psychological sense, so intense and so abnormal, you could say, that every word she was writing meant so much to her, was so important. So she was living for her diary, you could say, but at the other hand, she was living for Speer and Han and her friends, trying to get as much sense out of her life that was possible, and reading a lot, poetry, studying Russian. That's what she did, in fact, and giving lessons to people who wanted to learn Russian. So that is not a very glamorous way of living, but at the other hand, when you read her diary, you see how intense and deep her life became and was. But so at the outside there was the war, but there was that is the war everybody knows of. Not there were a few specific points in those years that the Nazis were closing in again and again, and it was more and more dangerous to and of course there was that particular important day that the Yellow Star was how do you say that was obliged for the Jews, and that was in 1942, and but she writes about the Yellow Star in a way nobody could imagine. She is writing that she sees a Jew with a yellow star on his jacket as a yellow flower, very triumphant, in a way that so she makes from the darkest moment in history sort of a blossoming event, which is so strange but beautiful. So I can't tell you much about all kinds of situations or stories. No, it was one long diary that was her life.
But she was not sort of marched straight off to the concentration camps and that was it, was it? It was a strangely gradual process.
It was. There was the Jewish Council. That was the... well, you have to explain your audience what the Jewish Council is. But maybe it's known in England, I don't know. But
I think the word council should... It's fine, we can just repeat. Yes.
Yeah, well, the Jewish Council was an organization within the Jewish community to decide who was to go to the camps and who was not. So that was a very cruel way of handling this particular...
But she decided to work there, which was quite clever in a way, because it meant
Yeah.
she could stay in Amsterdam.
She could stay in Amsterdam, but she didn't want to be protected at all. That's why she said after 2 weeks
How long
working
did she,
at the council...
with the Jewish Council, right? Yeah.
She was working with the Jewish Council.
Some of my favourite excerpts she writes are where she's such a wonderful character reader, you know, in observing people's character.
Yes.
She goes to the Jewish Council and she writes this wonderful description
Lines
of absolutely
about what is
of
going on at the council.
and it's just, you know.
Yes, that's true.
And the way she reads not just her friends, her Jewish friends, but also the German characters. The not, I don't know if she ever meets the SS in Amsterdam, but of course the German officials at the Jewish Council who have to who are really pretty disgusting characters. You know, the way they treat the way she sums them up and the way she describes them is actually she has a sense of humour in a way, because of course they're so small really, and they're
But her work at the Jewish Council made it possible for her to go to the camps and to go out of the camps again and back to Amsterdam.
Right.
But after
a little more freedom.
Yeah, a little more freedom, but she didn't want to be under the protection of the council anymore, and she said at the end, I will stay in the camp. I want to be there with the people I know and with my family, and I want to help the people there in the camps. So that was her free will to do that. But the Jewish Council is a chapter about which she says herself in her diary, the people after the war will will say a lot more about the council, and it's not right what they are doing. So, well, I think it's too complex to go on about this subject, but it's an important instrument for the Germans to get all those Jews out of Holland.
They're all there in one place.
Yes, and all the countries in Europe there were Jewish council.
They would have had all their names registered all in one place, and yes. I think for the purposes of the program itself as well, her interest in certain writers, of course, she mentioned Shakespeare, Dostoevsky, the Bible, Jung, and such forth. But Rilke, for her, she really is so.
Yes,
she loves Rilke, and Rilke, of course, is not so well known or fashionable now. A romantic German mystic and poet, really. Tell me more about her relationship with Rilke.
Well, that, in fact, you have to ask that a literary expert, because Rilke, so as you pronounce it, Rilke was at that time the modern poet, and everybody, every intellectual was reading him, but she has a very specific bond with this man Rilke. She found, and if you read Rilke closely, probably, I didn't do that, but there are people who did that. There are very much, there are quite a lot of thoughts of Rilke coming back in the diaries. If you compare them, they are very close friends, so to say. So the poet Rilke and Etty Hillesum are very, very much tied, and so the influence is big, and some people are saying, well, she read him so well, you can recognize him at every page of her diary. But nevertheless, she did that in an original way, and so it's interesting. What we did as a publisher, we published Rilke after I published the diaries, and so the same public found that book as well. That is Letters to a Young Poet of Rilke. Very good book. But it's more that is more for the literary expert to say there more about that.
We're allowed to get away with that world service. They're educated enough. Just about.
Just one more on the storyline, if I may. Obviously, diarists are not very good at writing retrospectively about their own deaths, but how did she die, and to what extent did she write prospectively about that?
She wrote several times about her own death. She wasn't afraid at all. She knew she wouldn't survive going to the East, as that was the way of saying, we go to the East, we have to work in the East, meaning Poland or Russia or whatever. But she died in Auschwitz. She wasn't gassed. She was probably, they don't know exactly what happened, but probably she got ill and died there. But so far as we know, she wasn't gassed. But that doesn't.
So more so for malnutrition and.
Yes,
more
she
so
died
for,
of typhus or whatever
oh,
you have there, and but there were not, as in the case of Anne Frank, people who saw her in the camp and talked about that later on. So that is not known, but known is that she perished in the camp.
And how many months, how long was she in Auschwitz for?
Probably not more than 3 weeks or 1 month, about that. Or maybe 2 months. They say it's the 30th of November. That is what the Red Cross says. And she's going away at the 17th of September.
Yeah,
so there would be 2.5 months, maybe. The Red Cross information is not always correct. So that is
I don't think
a
they
guess.
could even identify half because of what the Nazis did.
Yes, yes. So it's rather a guess, I think.
Before we won't get onto the depressing facts of the war.
But thanks to all your research, she lives on.
Yes, absolutely.
Well,
and in so many languages.
that's true, but I was the beginning. But the end is not coming, because there are year in, year out new readers, which is marvelous, and new countries where the translation is coming out. So I think this book will survive us all.